Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the sixth and final of our Fellows in the Field workshops for this year. My name is Michelle Deutschman. I'm the Executive Director of the UC National Center for Free Speech and Civic Engagement, and I'm pleased that you could join us today. Each year, the center selects fellows from a broad range of disciplines and backgrounds, such as law, journalism, higher education, and technology. Fellows receive funding to conduct research that will further the national conversation related to expression and democratic participation on college campuses. For anyone that's interested, applications for our next class of fellows will open in January. Today, we will be diving deeply into the work of two center fellows, Dr. Cerri Banks and Dr. Jennifer Lambe. Jenny and Cerri's research takes us right to the epicenter of campus speech controversies. How do administrators effectively balance identity, diversity, and expression? In just the last 2 weeks, we have seen these exact topics take center stage at Yale, the University of Michigan, and at MIT. Today is an extra special Fellows in the Field because we also have a guest from the Knight Foundation, Yvette Alexander, who will join us in a few minutes to share some of Knight's recent research on these issues. But before we welcome Yvette, I want to introduce our panelists and ask them to talk a bit about their research. Dr. Banks received her PhD in Cultural Foundations of Education and a Certificate of Advanced Studies in Women's Studies from Syracuse University. She's come back to where she got her PhD from. She specializes in sociology of education, cultural studies, and qualitative research. Committed to educational reform and inclusion, Banks draws from educational theory, feminist theory, and critical race theory in her work and in her teaching, research, and writing. Her newest project, entitled No Justice, No Peace, College Student Activism, Race Relations, and Media Cultures, examines the implications of changing tides of student activism for college campuses. Through interviews with Black college administrators from around the country, Cerri explored the relationship between Black students and Black administrators as it relates to free speech, social media, and activism. Dr. Lambe is an associate professor in the communication department at the University of Delaware with a joint appointment in the legal studies minor. She's a founding faculty member of the University of Delaware Center for Political Communication and is directing the center's initiative on free and responsible expression. Dr. Lambe received her PhD from the University of Minnesota in 2000. Other current and recent projects she's working on include a forthcoming book tentatively titled Remedies for Hate Speech, as well as an improved measurement of public and campus willingness to censor. Jenny surveyed the membership of the National Association of Diversity Officers in Higher Education in order to report on their experiences navigating the tensions between diversity and free expression. Welcome to both of you. Cerri, I'm going to ask you to start by telling us about sort of the origin of your research and overall what you found.
Hi, thank you, Michelle. Thank you, Jenny. I'm so glad to be on this panel with all of you. It's been a long time coming, so I thank you again for the invitation and all the work that's gone into make this successful. You know, as you mentioned, Michelle, I've been working on a book, No Justice, No Peace, College Student Activism, Race Relations, and Media Cultures, with a co-editor. And as we were interviewing folks, reading chapters that people were writing for the text, it became really clear to me that the relationship between Black administrators and Black student activists needed to be explored. Part of the reason is that Black administrators, we were finding, and I think new on some level, carry a lot of the work at our institutions with Black student activists. The things going on in the world, the culture and climate don't stop at our doorstep. So the impact of the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, the reckoning that college students are asking students to have with their past and the symbols that represent racism, all of these things are infiltrating, as they should, our institutions, and we really need to pay attention to them. And what I learned is that it's Black administrators who are carrying a lot of that work. This project was personal for me in some ways because I had started to wonder whether or not my toolbox had gotten rusty when it comes to work with Black student activists because of a number of experiences I had. And just in anecdotal conversations, even before the research with other administrators, I had heard things like, I'll read you directly. You know, a Black student placed a petition in a student newspaper asking a Black administrator administrator not to participate in the institution's Black graduation. A Black chief diversity officer being cursed at while trying to speak to Black students during a protest, and feelings of frustration and disrespect. A Black administrator being accused of supporting hate speech when defending free speech and not feeling very well prepared to address the arguments because she agreed with the students. And so there were all these challenges that were coming up that folks were trying to work through personally and professionally. And when the opportunity to work with the center came up, I thought that this was a perfect opportunity for me to look at that a little bit closer. So I interviewed 10 college and university administrators from a range of institutions, public, private, HBCU, women's institution. They were large, they were mid-size, and as I mentioned, public and private. There were a range of titles: chief of staff, vice presidents for student affairs, chief diversity officers. And I asked them questions that focused on their experience with working with Black student activists, the impact social media had on that, and institutional responses to activism in social media. There were a range of themes, including that social media can be good and bad, and that we have to be trained in it to meet students where they are and help them use it wisely and responsibly. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit more about that a little later on. And that being Black brings particular challenges when working with institutions and students, and that the right preparation and education can help both students and institutions address the matter. Everyone was very clear: you can't address these matters in the middle of a crisis. What's most uplifting, I think, when we think about this is that most of the administrators described their work as rewarding, even though it was challenging. And so I was able to use these interviews to write the article for the center, and also to create a planning guide that campuses can use to start preparing for this conversation.
Thanks so much, Cerri. We definitely are going to dive into social media and its impact in a little bit. So now that you've set the table, I'm now going to ask Jenny to set the table for her research and sort of what brought her to this moment. Go ahead, Jenny.
So I have had an interest in the tension between hate speech and free speech for a long time, because I find it a particularly challenging balancing of different goods in society. And then I also started working with our Vice Provost for Diversity in 2015 on my own campus to do sort of regular programming about how free speech and hate speech intersect. And so through my relationship with her, we started talking about the challenges for diversity officers in trying to balance these issues, and how they really didn't receive any training about it, and how they don't necessarily always have a voice at the sort of high-level administration meetings. And so I got really curious about what this was looking like on other campuses, whether this was a unique experience to her. I doubted it. But so I ended up, there's very little research on this topic at this point. So I ended up doing an initial 10 in-depth interviews with diversity officers from a variety of different campuses. And then I used those interviews to develop a survey that the National Association for Diversity Officers in Higher Education, they agreed to partner with me on this research, and they sent it out to their membership. And we received about 200 responses. And we asked them everything from how their office was structured, because that did seem to make a difference in the ways in which they were able to balance these things. And then we asked them about the kinds of services that they tried to offer, both proactive and reactive, in terms of responding to these kinds of issues on campus. And then we also asked them in just an open-ended way what the most effective and what the least effective responses that they have seen on their campus.
Terrific. And I know that both you and Cerri are going to share some of those effective and less effective models with us. So now that we've sort of set the stage, I want to turn it over to our guest. As you can imagine, Jenny and Cerri are not alone in their interest in studying the intersection of speech and diversity and inclusion. And the Knight Foundation, a national organization working to foster informed and engaged communities, has been studying these issues for almost 2 decades. Yvette Alexander, the Director of Learning and Impact at Knight, is here to share some of their most recent data on students and speech. Welcome, Yvette. Thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, Michelle, for having me. I'm certainly honored to be a part of this important discussion today and be among this amazing research, and to share with you a bit of what we've been learning from 17 years of student surveys at the intersection of speech and inclusion. Just a note that throughout our history, Knight Foundation has invested more than $100 million in grants to further and reinvigorate First Amendment principles for future generations as our society continues to evolve. And Knight also funds the only research of its kind to track and trend student attitudes towards the First Amendment, particularly free speech and expression at both the high school and college level. We've tended to focus on students because we see them really as the future gatekeepers of our democracy. They're the ones who will decide how the principles and values of our democracy, including both speech and inclusion, will be applied in practice. And the world has changed a lot since 2004, and we've seen some interesting shifts in that time that we can look at today. Just a brief overview of the portfolio of work. So we've been polling high school students since 2004, most recently at sample sizes around 10,000 students, so it's a good group. And in 2016, we commissioned Gallup to start regularly surveying four-year college students at sample sizes around 3,000 undergraduates, the latest of which was released last year. These studies and data downloads, by the way, are available on the Knight Foundation website, so feel free to go and check them out. And before we dive in, I'm excited to say for the first time publicly that in partnership with Ipsos, we're coming out of the field with the next iteration of our college survey with an improved sample from their knowledge panel that will include all types of college students and a general population survey that reveals how Americans at large think about free expression, issues, and events. Very interesting results that we're seeing from that so far. Go ahead and do next slide. So the first trend that I want to bring our attention to is among high school students. So we see, over the course of our research, emerging race and gender gaps in perceptions concerning the First Amendment. After reading a description of the First Amendment, students were asked whether it goes, quote, too far in its rights and guarantees. And, we see that between 2006 and 2011, there's a general increase in support for free speech and the First Amendment, which stays relatively constant in the years following. However, since 2011, about the time the majority of high schoolers got on social media, we see consistently widening race and gender differences on this question. So there didn't used to be much of a gender gap, and one emerges. And a gap between the white respondents and students of color, which was always there in part, starts to widen and deepen and consistently has done so throughout the rest of the study. So interesting that it emerged about the time the high schoolers got on social media. And we do know that the impact of social media on young people does differ significantly by race and gender. Other research has shown that rates of depression, for example, among young social media users also differs similarly along race and gender lines. Next slide. When it comes to college students, overall, they see our First Amendment rights as less secure since pre-election 2016. In particular, free speech, which fell from 73% saying that they saw speech rights as secure in 2016 to 59% in 2019. We also saw big dips in freedom of press, and although it's not shown here, but our new data is showing that freedom of assembly is down quite a bit as well. Next slide. When it comes to speech on campus specifically, students generally support the idea of a wide exposure to all types of speech on campus, with 82% saying it's more important for colleges to expose students to all types of speech versus protecting students from speech they may find offensive. And we also see that however, we also see that students do favor the idea of providing safe spaces or areas on campus that are supposed to be free from threatening actions, ideas, conversations, and speech. Next slide. So this is interesting to me. We started asking in 2019 about whether students felt the First Amendment protected people like them, so making it very personal to their identity and who they are. And we found very significant gaps as well, depending on race, gender, and also party identity of the students. So I think you can see here some pretty significant differences between white students. So 53% of white students saying that they strongly agree that the First Amendment protected them, whereas only 25% of Black students felt the same way. Men were more likely than women, and Republicans more likely than Democrats to feel protected by the First Amendment as well. So I think this is a critical issue to pay attention to, the sorts of ideas and sense of efficacy regarding these rights that we're bringing into situations when we get on college campuses. Next slide. So perhaps considering what we just saw, it's not surprising that when it comes to campus, we see that college students increasingly favor restrictions on speech that target minority groups, such as racial slurs or stereotypical costumes that align with minority stereotypes, but not on political views. So we do see that students remain open to the idea of political views. And I think the particular wording here with political views that might be offensive. So they're not necessarily wanting to not be offended ever. They do, however, draw the line when it comes to speech that seems to target minority groups on campus. Next slide. Students, so turning to social media, students regard social media as the central forum for campus discussions. So, they're definitely one and the same. It's not just in real life versus online discussion happening. There's a blur there, and it seems to be weighted in the students' opinion towards social media being where most of that is taking place. But they do say that discourse is getting worse. So 41% said the dialogue on social media was civil. That's pre-election 2016. And that came down to 29% in our last survey. Next slide. Students also say that hate speech is a problem on social media, and majorities favor increased responsibility on the part of both platforms and users in terms of wanting to reduce the incidence of hate speech on social media. So in our surveys on this, our wider surveys on this, there seems to be a lot of juxtapositions on what to do with speech on social media. People like the idea that you can say whatever you want. However, they do draw the line when speech is targeting groups of protected status and things like that. Next slide. I think that might be the last one. So just in summary, it's important to understand that college students, they do not have a uniform lived experience or perceptions when it comes to speech. When they arrive on campus, some feel more personally served by speech rights than others. And there's significant racial differences there. Students are increasingly in favor of restrictions on speech that when it may cause harm or alienate people of color, especially in a campus learning environment, but also more broadly. Yet they remain supportive of having politically offensive views on campus still. So we might understand this as a challenge to educators to find ways to promote both speech and inclusion at the same time, which is definitely hard to do. It can be hard to do. So just a note that at night, we have the new public opinion polling coming out soon. So stay tuned on that. That will be coming out in January. And, as we continue to research this and others research this, definitely believe that further understanding of public views and sentiments on this topic is critical for policymakers, educators, and others grappling with how principles of speech play out in an increasingly digital and diverse America. So thank you for allowing us to highlight some of our research on campus speech and inclusion concerns, and excited to hear the new insights coming from the research fellows today.
Thank you so much, Yvette. It's great to have you. And obviously the data you shared is definitely going to help enrich our conversation and deepen it. For anybody that's attending, folks should know that both Cerri and Jenny's research and the most recent Knight report, you can find that in the Q&A, so you can access that. So Yvette is signing off, but I'm going to turn to Cerri and Jenny and just get some quick, what responses you have to what Yvette shared. Were you surprised? Is this sort of what you expected? Jenny, you want to start?
Sure. I'm not terribly surprised by the findings. However, as somebody who also studies public opinion about free expression issues, I do have some, I first of all want to say that I very much appreciate their commitment funding regular surveys on these issues. It used to be, prior to their doing this, and a little bit the Freedom Forum First Amendment Center, it was very spotty to try to get any kind of sense over time of how views were changing. And so I appreciate that very much. I do, however, have some concerns about the phrasing of some of the questions, and maybe their new research will deal with this. But for example, the one that asks people to choose, do you think it's more important to let people say what they want to say versus, protect some people against harm? It seems like that's sort of a false dichotomy, and that there are other choices. And so I feel like there's a lot of error that gets captured in there too, as well as the actual attitudes.
That makes sense. The devil's in the details, right?
Yeah.
Cerri, what about you?
Yeah, I wasn't surprised either, in part because it's what we're seeing on campus. It's what students are telling us, right? And a couple of the things that we know for sure is they don't always understand what the First Amendment is and means and what it covers. And then we haven't really done a great job with as institutions with talking about the place that hate speech has in the free speech conversation. So it is free speech, but it doesn't undo the harm that happens. And in our communities, we need to be spending the time addressing that harm. Because it's free, and it doesn't mean that we can't then continue to educate students, interact with students, have them engage across differences, and do all the things we know that can help them. One of the things that I talked about in my research was there are oftentimes hard messages that students have to hear. This is one of them, right? That hate speech can be protected, but that they are also stronger than a flyer on a car, right? That we can find other ways to engage in conversation that address the hate speech so that harm is not done, or at least is somewhat rectified in our communities. Speech is powerful, as we know, and hate speech carries differing impacts to differing groups of students. And so what's encouraging is that it's students from minoritized backgrounds. It is also students who have more privilege that are acting as allies to these students in these conversations. And so I'm not surprised at the numbers we're seeing, because that's what we're seeing on our campuses. Their students are saying, I know it's free, but we need to talk about and do something about the harm that it causes on our campuses.
Absolutely. And I would say it's called free speech, but it's not free in terms of someone bears a cost of the harm. And one of the things that I find empowering about both of your research is that rather than sort of dwelling in hate speech is terrible. It's really, you're both looking for ways that all the different stakeholders at campus can be responding in an effective way that can amplify voices. And before we get to sort of what are the best proactive and reactive strategies, I do want to talk for a minute about social media, because I think that we really cannot overestimate the role that social media plays in how events on campus unfold and how the campus and greater community responds to those situations. And the data that Knight shared indicates that students see social media as the central forum for campus discussion, which of course was completely different than when, for instance, I went to college. So, Jenny, you found that social media was the most frequent sort of location where diversity officers observed tensions between DEI efforts and free expression. And Cerri, you found that moments of student activism posted online could actually be used as, quote, fodder for outside influencers, unquote, and open students up to critique and harassment. So as campus community members continue to use social media, I'd love to ask each of you, what are some of the challenges that you think administrators should be working to address at this time? And Cerri, why don't you kick this one off?
Okay. So yes, social media, it is here to stay. And I always preface these conversations by saying I am not a social media hater. In fact, I loves the TikTok. A little too much, probably, because I use it at times to procrastinate. But, it is a part of communication today. It is a dominant number one part of how people communicate today. And so we have to pay attention to that in higher ed. I think we're doing better. than we were when it first came out. But we have to make sure that we are trained and that we're training others. So in my research, folks describe good parts of social media. One of the people said social media is the way many student groups and student activists really build consensus around their priorities. I have seen students create spectacular social media campaigns, especially around environmental justice and racial justice. And so we need to acknowledge that this is an important part of what we do. We also know that there are some challenging parts, particularly when inaccurate information goes out, when confidential information is shared online. I don't know if folks know that Yik Yak is back. Yik Yak was an anonymous platform that I thought had gone away. It's come back, and it has been the basis of a lot of the Title IX activism that's going on now, with names of individuals being published and institutions being challenged. And so it is a way that folks get together. The anonymity, of course, causes challenges. And one of the things that another participant brought out was that sometimes when students use social media for their activism, it's like they're in an echo chamber, right? They're not hearing a range of ideas or opinions or even truth about whatever the topic is. They're only hearing what folks right around them who may have similar thoughts often think about. So we have to think about how we help students learn the basics about social media, how far-reaching the impact is. I'm still surprised when students will say they didn't want their families to know something, or they didn't want certain groups to know something. And I will say, but you put it out for all the world to see, right? I think they forget sometimes the impact and the reach of social media. So there are a number of ways that we can help them use it more widely. I made a couple of notes here from the article, helping them understand that accurate information will get them further along, and that everything they read is not truth because it's posted on social media. Helping them understand the repercussions that can come if they reveal confidential information about not just about themselves, but about an organization, about another student, about a faculty member, that there are expectations of confidentiality in certain settings, and then helping them respond and correct inaccuracy when these things come up.
Absolutely. And all of these things, there's civic literacy, there's digital literacy, there's constitutional literacy, right? And I think higher education needs to play a role in all of those kinds of education. Okay, Jenny, are you a social media lover or hater or?
I'm a social media user. I would not say I'm a social media lover. I have not yet discovered TikTok, Cerri, so maybe that's for the best if it's a good time waster.
Don't do it, Jenny. Don't do it.
But I think social media presents unique challenges too, because it is not necessarily happening on a university platform, and so in terms of legality, there's almost nothing that institutions can do with things that are happening outside of their campus platforms. And there was actually a recent Supreme Court case about this at a high school, in a high school situation. And so legally, I think there's not a lot that can be done, but that doesn't mean that there aren't effects that should be addressed. And I agree with Cerri completely that there needs to be digital literacy taught to everyone. And just simple things like, yeah, you might think that you set your privacy settings in a certain way, but someone else could copy what you said and share it widely. So you just have to assume that if you're putting something out there, anyone could see it. So think about it. And if you wouldn't want your grandma to see it, then you probably shouldn't post it. And
if I could just add to that, Jenny, you're absolutely right. And then it's helping what happens then is students want the institution, their administrators, their faculty to protect them from the things that are coming, right? And so just reminding them that when you put that out there, you are opening yourself up from responses from folks all over. And so some of the most difficult cases I've had to manage are students getting death threats, students being talked about horribly because of their ideals or their beliefs. And so that's part of the reason that digital literacy is so important. And there are groups out there, and of course, I'm not going to remember the name right now, that can come to our institutions and help students think about their social media use.
I will also say, I don't think that the law has caught up sufficiently for when there are, when people are getting death threats and their private information, like where they live, is being published. I don't think our law still has caught up to deal with those situations very well. And that not almost, but it's very strongly against women and people of color that those kinds of things most often happen.
Well, I think you're both highlighting that the law can be a really blunt instrument. And, certainly in the case of high school students, we're still using a case from, Vietnam War days. I will just add one thing that Jenny said, which is that it is very unusual for universities to be found kind of responsible or liable in these cases where it's an outside platform. There was a case, though, with the University of Mary Washington, where a number of women were, again, just really horrible harassment that was happening online through Yik Yak. That was before it disappeared. And we can put that case into the recap email as well, because it was one of the few times where the court said, you do have a responsibility in certain situations. So I thought that was heartening. Again, I'm sure if I was counsel for a university, I would be concerned by that. So of course, always the push and pull. So both of you have already started to touch on, and we got some questions from participants earlier about how we respond in these moments. And so there's both reactive and proactive. Quoting Cerri, she always says you can't respond to a crisis during the crisis. Why don't we start with sort of in the moment strategies? Either things that you think are particularly effective or less effective. And if either of you can speak to this issue of what does it mean to have the 24-hour news cycle and having to respond quickly. I'll let either one of you start. Okay, I'll let Jenny start.
Oh, okay.
Sorry, if you'd like to, go ahead.
Okay, I'll start. I because I believe so strongly in the being proactive and building in policies and practices and systems that work before anything happens. It's hard for me to talk about in the moment, but there are some best practices that are in the moment. So, for example, you are going to have to keep lines of communications open and go to students where they are. It is not the time to double down on the First Amendment and all the policies and all that, right? That is not the time to do that. What we know about student activism is that there may be one thing that sets the protest moment off, but it's usually a number of things that have happened over time, as evident in the demands that students will put together, where you'll see there are a lot of things that they're asking for that we haven't likely paid attention to. You want to respond right away. Gone are the days where we in higher ed could take the time and get all the facts. And even if your message is just, we've seen this, we heard you, we know this is going on, we're going to continue to get all the information we need to get, and because we still have to do that, and then get back to you and set a date to get back and stick to that date. Remind students that we are responsible for their safety and their well-being. So there are behaviors that are just not okay during these moments that they'll need to think, and again, if we've prepared, they won't be surprised by some of the things that we have put in place. Be ready to acknowledge, right? To listen and to acknowledge, but don't give away the farm. You don't have to agree to everything in a moment, right? That we're going to do all these things, because I think that will just lead to more frustration down the line as we gather information and put that. I think we have to engage the entire campus and relevant departments in what's going on. And just remember that our students, sometimes we expect them, so their tactics and strategies may not always be perfect, right? But if we look under the surface of what they are protesting about, demanding. There's usually truth to what it is they're asking us to do, and they're pushing us to be better. So it's that fine balance between listening, holding, not giving away the farm. And I'll just add this too. I'm an old school dean, so, a lot of what has frustrated folks recently is the level of disrespect they feel, the cursing and swearing and shouting, and no one has to take abuse. And we are still educators first, right? And so I think it's important also that students hear that message, that we can have any conversation we need to have, or we're going to engage in a way that doesn't harm. And I say to them, just because you're on the side of right, if you are, doesn't mean you can behave any kind of way.
Makes sense. It sounds kind of like the conversation sometimes I need to have with my kids. Jenny, I'll let you kind of add on to reactive, and then you can lead us into proactive, which I know is where both of you really focus your work.
Yeah. So I'm going to use a specific example from my campus that happened just a few weeks ago. We had an unannounced visit from a church group from Philadelphia that came to campus, and they were actually standing on city property, but they were in the middle of our green. So they were on a sidewalk, and they were saying horrible things. They were telling LGBTQ students that they should slit their wrists. They were telling a Muslim woman that she had a bomb in her hijab. I could just go on. But anyway, what they were saying was horrific. The university did not have any proactive response to such situations planned. And so the only thing that happened was that there was a police presence, and the police structured themselves so that it looked to the students like the police were protecting the protesters. And they were bothered by that perception that the police were there to protect the protesters rather than to protect students from being abused. It ended up there were some students who ended up getting arrested because of their sort of physical interactions with the protesters. So it was a very unfortunate situation. And in that immediate response, I feel like the university was lacking. I feel like that could have been handled better. But perhaps even worse was the letter that went out to the campus community afterwards, which, as Cerri, basically they doubled down on the First Amendment. Like, they have we don't like what they said, but they have the same First Amendment rights that you have. And it just was received as completely tone deaf by students. And so, I've been trying to work with our interim chief diversity officer and others on campus and maybe come up with a better crisis plan for those kinds of things. But again, I feel like the real important work that allows you to respond well in particular crisis situations is the proactive work that you need to do. And by having plans, by doing regular programming where you talk about these issues, let's talk about why it's important to protect freedom of expression in a time where there's not a lot of emotions running high. Let's talk about the harms that do come from hate speech, and that even though we might not be able to legally do something in terms of a fix or banning somebody from coming to campus, that there are still options for how we can mitigate that harm, even though it's free speech.
It's so true, Jenny. I think we, in an article I just wrote recently, I compared our usual process to it's higher ed's versions of thoughts and prayers, right? Something happens, we have a forum, there's a lot of emoting and promises made, and then everyone goes back to their daily life until another event happens, and we go through that whole process again. And there is a place for those forums and community meetings and groups, but the foundation of the work has to be the proactive work that we've done. I'm back at Syracuse University working. I'm very proud of my alma mater. So this is not just because I'm biased, but one of the things that I love coming here, they have in place what we're calling the student activism and engagement team. And this is staff and faculty, right, who meet regularly to talk about these issues, who are sort of first on the scene when there's something planned or when there's something unplanned that happens on campus. They engage with students around whatever the issues are, and their goal is to support their activism, but also to share information and hear information. I just finished for us the first draft of a very detailed protest policy. And the goal is that everyone will be trained on what we will do when we have a planned event and when we have an event that's unplanned. And now all of this takes time, right? We'll do some tabletops, we'll do some drills. All of this takes time. And that's why I always say it can't happen when you're in the middle of something. And the goal is that everyone has a role, is capable, understands their role, and able to go forward. You know, the other proactive thing I think that has to happen is you have to know who students are. You have to know who the student leaders are. You have to have engaged with them in ways before we get to an event. They will often, I've had the experience where students will call you and say, we are going to protest at 3:00 on here. These are the issues, right? Even ahead of time, which also helps. But this gets back into building our DEIA work, media literacy, digital literacy, knowledge and skills related to free speech into the foundation of the institution. And it's difficult, right? Because students come and go. And so we are examining now some ways to create sustainable, I don't even want to call it programming, because it's not programming, it's sustainable training and development that students continuously go through and prepare them, that prepares them to work with their peers around these issues also.
And I think that's one of the tricky things on campuses is that some of your population on your campus is there for a long period. And then there's students who are cycling through all the time. And so you can't just have this programming be a one-off. This has to be something that you're continually talking about, or else a whole portion of a very important portion of your population on campus isn't going to be exposed or remember that you've talked about this.
Right. I mean, you know that you both know that I'm going to agree with you. I'm always fond of saying that, you know, we don't just talk about how to write a college essay one time, right? We continue to inculcate that and practice that skill. And so these kinds of skills, I think, need to also be practiced. Sri, I want to give you a chance to get a comment, but then I also wanted to try to integrate some of our audience questions. Mm-hmm. Someone had written a question about restorative justice and facilitating dialogue between parties that might be at odds. And, you know, Jenny, I don't know if you have thoughts about whether this can be helpful in remedying some of the hurt that comes out of these exchanges.
I think that it has the potential to be helpful if it's done well. It has the potential to go really wrong if it's done badly. And so I think the devil is in the details, again, as you like to say, about how this is happening. But I will say that several of the diversity officers that I surveyed mentioned that explicitly as one of their things that was going well, that had been a most successful practice on their campus.
Okay. And I was going to ask, we also had another question that came in earlier about someone who works on a primarily white institute that values free speech and is very clear about valuing free speech, and then doesn't feel like they acknowledge the social and emotional trauma related to the comments. And the question was, how does this person work to create an environment where there's a focus on the social consequences rather than, you know, sanctioning or punishment, but the social consequences for the person who's engaged in the targeted or hurtful speech?
Yeah, so I think, you know, it really depends on the role in the institution, but the steps are the same, right? So supporting students when harm has occurred is what's most important, right? So even if the institution, right, is not taking a stance that you agree with, there are still ways to support students, which is our responsibility, right, as administrators, as faculty, as staff, to both help educate and support. So I think anything that we can do to ensure that we have the right policies in place, anytime that harm occurs, there is dialogue with all the parties that are involved, right? So they have the opportunity to make change. And then I think anytime you can engage with folks at the institution, depending on what your level is, to participate in things like this, readings that you can share, so some folks, we have hierarchies in higher ed, right? And some folks might not be careful saying to an administrator, you all aren't paying attention to the harm that's happening to these students, but there are other ways to engage that conversation through reading, through sharing of cases that are happening on campuses. One book I always like to talk about, well, there are a couple. There's Segal Ben Por's Free Speech on Campus, and there is Ulrich Baer's book, What Snowflakes Get Right. And I'm not going to remember the second part of that, but he does a really excellent job of saying hate speech and freedom of expression are not mutually exclusive, right? That we have a responsibility to address both. And that part of the reason we must do that is that many of these hateful speakers and others seek out our institutions because they know that higher ed is a place where people find valid regarding knowledge, right? And so I think we have to be aware of our place in the institution, but wherever our place, we can make sure that we're addressing these issues and the harm that comes particularly with students, and find some allies, some like-minded folks to do that with you. That's a great article somebody should write.
Can't think of anyone who would write
really
such
important.
an article.
Yeah.
Jenny, did you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'd like to add, I agree completely that using actual case studies is a fantastic way to get people to have these conversations and to maybe actually understand where people who are feeling this harm are coming from, and be able to have that in a way that's not a sort of threatening or accusatory conversation. The other thing I'll just mention is that a lot of the diversity officers, both that I interviewed and that I surveyed, did mention that they feel like their institutional responses are largely determined by their president or chancellor or the head of the institution, and whether or not that person is how they are being advised by their general counsel. And I think that is something that needs further study as well.
Every single one of my folks that I interviewed said it depended on who was at the top, whether or not they felt supported or they could respond in a particular way.
Okay, the questions are flooding in, which is exciting because that means people are listening closely. So I'm going to try to get through as many as we can. Someone from Stanford, Emmeline, I hope I'm saying your name correctly, talks about how they have a team similar to the one that Syracuse has, and is asking what happens when students actively disrespect your team. For example, where students had a decoy off-campus protest plan that sent staff on a wild goose chase. How do you engage these students either pre or post activism? Cerri, I'll let you kick it off, and then Jenny.
Okay. Yeah. So I always say protest is not polite, right? We can't always know everything that students are going to do. But I'm a firm believer in that we have expectations for student behavior, but we need to make sure the house is in order, right? And so if we've done all the proactive things we have to do, yes, there are still students that are going to be disrespectful. They're smart. That's why they're at our institutions, right? They're going to be decoys. But if we've built relationships with students, at some point, things die down, right? We get back into a routine. How are we working with our student clubs and our student leaders when we are not in crisis? How are we engaged with them? What do they know that we will support and we won't? And that's where the policies come in really clear. So I know one of the things that was going on at a protest here, the Not Again SU protest, was around food and students saying they were being starved. And then, so in this draft plan, we have said, if this goes on for a long time, we will feed you 3 meals for 2 days. After that, you need to use your swipe, and you'll be able to come back, because students were afraid if they left, they wouldn't be able to come back to their protests. So there are, some people say, well, don't tell them that, because you give them too much information, they're going to get ideas. They have ideas. They have more ideas than we do sometimes. And so we want to give as much information to students as we can about our expectations. And then if there's really egregious behavior, so if there is violence, students know that we will have to likely get the authorities involved if there's violence. If we're putting in information about what happens with their grades and their work, we just have to give them the information, and then we have it to point to when things happen.
Okay. Jenny, do you want to add, or can I go to the next question?
Go ahead to the next question, because we're running out of time.
Okay, so someone was asking about when an incident occurs locally or globally that has a direct or indirect impact on the student body. Is it necessary for the institution to always release an acknowledgement statement?
I would say that students expect that their institution will issue a statement about this, and they often will criticize if it's not done quickly. I think that there's a fine balancing that has to happen between issuing something quickly and issuing something that's meaningful. And so I heard from several of the diversity officers that sometimes they get bypassed in creating these statements, and that it's the sort of president's office and the Office of Communication and Marketing that decide on what's going to get put out there. And because they want to do it in a quick fashion, they don't really consult the diversity officers. And I think that's a mistake. I think that they can wait, maybe they do need to put something out, like Cerri said, like, we know this is happening, we're going to generate a statement, but they need to also take the time to incorporate the diversity officer. I think another thing that we haven't mentioned is just like the toll that these things take on diversity officers. And I would imagine, Cerri, any administrator of color, to try to respond to these things quickly when you yourself are trying to process what's happened and are upset about this yourself. And so I feel like, sometimes I do agree when there's some very specific thing that happens on campus that there needs to be a quick response. I'm not so sure that it's as necessary to be so quick when it's something more national or international. I do agree that there should be some statement made usually, but I think it needs to be carefully crafted and to incorporate the diversity officer's opinion in it.
I'm really happy.
What I would add to that quickly is that what we also have to do, because the institution could be sending a notice every day. So when I was at a previous institution, there had been KKK flyers put on cars downtown, and students were very upset. I responded, the AVP responded, but students were very angry that it didn't come from the president. We have to help students realize that every single message won't come from the president, right? That institutionally. And so I think that's working with our communications folks to know when things come from the president, but students also understanding that the dean or others, and one way I've been able to do that is by having other people's names on documents, right? Because that will help normalize that in some ways, or else, and making the decision about what needs a message, right? So some institutions have said if it's national, right, or international and wide impact, that the institution should, and then everything sort of flows from there. But that's one of the hard ones, because students do expect a letter on everything. And when you send it on one thing and not the other, it's not good.
Right. It's very tricky. Cerri, I was also going to ask you quickly to kind of follow up on what Jenny queued up about the personal toll that these incidents, can take, especially if you, in your work, it was talking to Black administrators. And, if you were going to pick top 3 support mechanisms that universities could develop, I think your research showed that those mechanisms were largely lacking. That would be great. And then Jenny, I'm going to put in the queue one more attendee question, which is talking about what would be the ideal sort of training and development for administrators, faculty, and staff so that they don't do further harm, right? Okay, so Cerri and then Jenny, and then we'll have to wrap up.
Okay, I'll be very quick. You're right. There are not a lot of mechanisms in place, according to the folks that I've interviewed, and I will be honest, in my own personal experience, right? Some of them talked about sitting at cabinet meetings when major racist incidents have happened in the world and no one around the table bringing it up. So I think acknowledging, right, this is the things that happen inside and outside of the institution, support from the highest levels, again, proactively infusing this work across campus and increasing cultural competency so that folks can be prepared to engage in the work. A lot of the responsibilities falls on Black administrators, one who even said, don't think that just because I'm Black, I know how to do this, right? That I had to put work in to learn how to engage around these issues. And I think putting a team in place, having the expectations from all of the leaders, and acknowledging the humanity of Black administrators and Black students would go a long way.
Go ahead, Jenny.
Michelle, I apologize. Can you repeat the question just a little bit?
Yes, it was about if you could create training for administrators, staff, and faculty so that they can not do harm when they are responding to these incidents, what would that entail? And then someone also asked if both of you are going to be creating models that can be shared with other universities. And so I would say if there's anybody on here who would like to fund the creation of such models, they should reach out to me. Now, go ahead, Jenny.
So I'm actually just starting to think about this because I actually would like to create a training, particularly for administrators and staff. But I think one of the key things is to get people away from the legalistic approach of responding to these questions, that it doesn't always have to be what policy or what rule can we create, but how can we show support, even though we recognize that this is free expression. How can we address the harms that are created? And there are creative ways that we can do this and encourage students to think of creative ways to respond, and allow for there to be community building that comes out of these negative situations. And I think really changing that mindset away from a legalistic approach is really the crucial thing that I would want to see happen.
I think that's
I did pull together a planning guide with that I think it's one of the next projects and sort of expanding that. So we should talk.
I was just going to say, I think that's a great place to end it. As an attorney myself and as, someone who's overseeing the center, I think some of the ironies is that people are often looking to the law for the answer. And then when it comes to this, in this case, the hard question is the speech protected? Because in most cases, the speech is going to be protected. I think the harder question is how, as individuals and community members, do we respond? And an even harder question, and someone posed this, and I'm sorry we're not getting to it. What is the value of protecting this really ugly speech, and why do we continue to do it? Because as awful as it is, I still do believe that free speech is a tool that we need in the toolbox in order to facilitate change. And these are the things that the center is thinking about and talking about. And our panelists have been amazingly gracious in their time that they have given to us. Their fellowship was over months ago. Both of them have agreed to be in discussion with anybody who is on today. We'll have their emails shared. And I'm really excited that there is so much thinking and sort of, even though we're online dialogue, because that's the only way that we're going to make progress on these issues is by really thinking critically and openly and in talking to other people about all of these things so that we can improve institutions and, do a better job of kind of reaching our mission of educating students. So with that, I'm going to say thank you. I'm going to just give a heads up to the folks that follow our programming, that we are going to be kicking off our Speech Spotlight Live program in December. And that for those of you that are UC affiliated, our Voice initiative, valuing open and inclusive communication and engagement, is the applications are open if you'd like to apply for seed money to basically further democratic learning and expression on campus. You can find information there on our website. I hope everybody has a wonderful rest of their afternoon and week, and we'll look forward to seeing everybody soon. Thank you so much.